Welcome to Western Civilization 134, the Napoleonic Era, Part 4, the Kings, Queens, and Generals of the Napoleonic Era. Now, usually, I don't get a chance to talk about a lot of the other rulers in other time periods, but since we spent so much time on Napoleon, it's only fair that we go around Europe and view some of the leaders and their queens that are fighting the French, because after all, they're always concerned that we got rid of Louis XVI, we could be next. So what worthy people do we have defending their country against Napoleon? Now we're going to look at George III, we're going to look at William III, we're going to look at Francis I or the second, depending on what term you're using. We will also look at Alexander I. We'll look at the big names. I'm not going to talk about the Spanish family. I'm not going to talk about General Bernadotte and his wife Julia, who are going to ultimately become the king and queen of Sweden, thanks to Napoleon recommending them, and the minor leaders in the Holy Roman Empire and in Italy. We've talked about the Pope a little bit, so we're just looking at the main coalition leadership. And we're going to start with England. The King of England during the Napoleonic Wars is good old George III. And George III has been around a long time. He was born in 1738. He'll live to 1820, so he's going to live to be 82, and he becomes king in 1760. Well, he's the American Revolution king as well, and he looks good in this particular picture. Of course, he's running a constitutional monarchy, so although he has power, it is really Parliament and the Prime Minister that's doing all the work and running everything, and he has an excellent group of leaders advising him, although his advice during the Revolution, the American Revolution, leaves a little bit to be desired. His wife, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, she was born in 1744 and died in 1818 at the age of 74. They were married in 1761, and they had 15 children. And the amazing thing is, 13 of them lived to adulthood, which is something that doesn't happen very often. So that's good old Queen Charlotte. And then here, unfortunately, is George III in the early 1800s. He did not age well. He's deaf, blind, and insane. It kind of comes and goes. There are a whole series of stories about him. There's one where there's a party being held, and he has a 20-minute conversation with an oak tree that he thought was Frederick the Great. But sometimes he is perfectly fine. So as a result of this in and out insanity, his son, the Prince Regent, the future George IV, kind of runs the country. Now I'm going to refer to him as George IV. He was born in 1762 and he lived to 1830, so he lives to be 68. He was Prince Regent from 1811 until the death of his father in 1820, and so he's king from 1820 to 1830. He's well known for his various affairs and problems with the ladies. One of his favorite things to do, however, he's an expert at meat sauces, and he put on a national contest to find the finest meat sauce in England, and the winner of it was given the title of A1. Well, if you know there's an A1 of steak sauce, you know that that company won the title so many times that they were allowed to use it as part of their name. If you can find an old box where they give the list of the awards, you'll find it that way. So anyway, the Prince Regent George IV, not one of my favorites. His comment when Napoleon died was, "I didn't know that she was still alive." You should be able to recognize this gentleman. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Two spectacular portraits. The first one is painted by Goya. The other one is painted by Sir Thomas Lawrence. But he tried on an occasion to get the trifecta. After the Battle of Waterloo, he went into Paris and asked Jacques-Louis David to please paint his portrait. And David said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I only paint important people." Wellington is one of the finest generals in the entire Napoleonic Wars outside of Napoleon. Most of his early experience was in India. And then, of course, he went into the peninsula in Spain and fought the Peninsular War against the French. Great success. And one of the things that he would do that was different, he did not expose all of his forces at the same time. He frequently liked to take defensive hilltop positions and then keep a large number of his men on the other side so that the attacker couldn't tell how many troops he had. Was well known, well respected as a soldier, and of course the winner at the Battle of Waterloo. He was also the military expert advising the British government on what to do during the War of 1812 in the United States. And later on, after the war, was a member of the House of Lords and worked on a lot of legislation. Unfortunately, it's legislation that is not, shall we say, pro-labor. So that is the Duke of Wellington. Now we come to Admiral Nelson. Horatio Nelson was the son of a clergyman. He was born in 1758. He lived till 1805, dying at the Battle of Trafalgar. He joined the Navy at the age of 12 and served in the Navy from 1770 to 1805. Admiral Nelson and his wife, Fanny Nesbitt. Of course, Admiral Nelson is the greatest naval officer of the Napoleonic Wars, revolutionizing tactics. But he's also well known for his affair. Here is Admiral Nelson with Emma Hamilton, the wife of the British ambassador to the Kingdom of Sicily and Naples, in one of her love letters. He was recuperating from being injured in a combat in Naples, and she nursed him to health, as well as giving him a child. Now, her husband was well aware of what was going on, and he was honored, if you will, but not later on. And then here is the portrait that Nelson carried with him. That portrait has a medal on Emma's chest, and that is the highest award that a civilian can receive from the military. It's for duty above and beyond. There were theatrical performances in London which made fun of this relationship and referred to this medal as for duty above and beyond the bedchamber. And there are any number of other portraits of Emma as Circe, as Spring. Here is a painting showing them, well, showing her helping him to recruit, and their little child that is produced, Horatia. After the death of Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar, she is on her own. Her husband eventually divorces her. I believe she received a few locks of his hair, but no money. Everything else went back to his wife. But Admiral Nelson is a national treasure. Trafalgar Square. They didn't throw him overboard when he was killed in the Battle of Trafalgar. They put him in a barrel and preserved him and brought him back to England for a great national funeral. The Emperor of Austria, Francis I. Now, he actually has two titles. He's Francis I, Emperor of Austria. He's also Francis II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, he's only Holy Roman Emperor to 1806. He starts in 1792, and then as in 1806, Napoleon dissolves the Holy Roman Empire, so he loses that second title. He was born in 1768 and lived till 1835. Now, he's a nice enough ruler. He is supposed to be an absolute monarch. Austria has an emperor, but it's the state of Austria. The country is polyglot of all sorts of different ethnic groups, and it's very hard to maintain a cohesiveness. There's always this friction between the German aspect and the Hungarian aspect. And so they're not as wealthy, they're not as powerful as some of the others. Now, they continue fighting most of the time in the Napoleonic Wars as a result of foreign aid from other members of the coalition. Elizabeth of Württemberg, his first wife, they were married in 1788. She died in 1790, complications due to childbirth. His second wife, Maria Theresa of Naples, they married in 1790. She died in 1807. She also died in childbirth. She had 5 children, but only 2 of them made it beyond the age of 10, one to 12 and one to 18. His third wife, Maria Ludovica of Modena, died of tuberculosis. Had 3 children. One lived to 17 and one lived to the age of 8. And the final wife, Caroline Augusta of Bavaria, who is known as Charlotte, she didn't have any children. So those are his 4 wives. This painting is always interesting because it always looks like he's being forced to stand in the pose of Louis XIV in his official regal robes. The master diplomat, Clement Lothar Wenceslaus, the Count and Prince Metternich. This is the man who controlled the destiny of Europe, particularly after the Napoleonic era. He's the master of Austria for 34 years after Napoleon is finally put into exile. He was born in 1773. He lived to 1859, lived to be 86. He oversaw all the negotiations at the Congress of Vienna. He worked with Talleyrand and other people. He is the master. And of course, ultimately, he has overthrown along with the emperor in the 1848 revolution. The interesting thing is, years ago I had a foreign exchange student from Hungary in my advanced placement class, and whenever I mentioned Metternich, he would hiss. He would go nuts. It took me a month for him to finally stop, to get it over with. So when I talked about the differences between the Germans and the Hungarians, that was the Hungarian difference. But Metternich is the ultimate in diplomacy. Field Marshal Karl von Schwarzenberg. He's the top commander for the Austrian army and a good friend of Napoleon's. He actually saved Josephine at a party one time. She was having a party at Malmaison early in his career, and he was ambassador for a while to France too. And she had decided to put up a gauze tent in the back, kind of like a circus tent, and they lit it with candles. Oh man, needless to say, something caught on fire and the whole thing just went up in a puff of smoke. And they noticed that pretty much everybody got out from underneath it, but they couldn't find Josephine. So he went back into the blaze and found her and brought her smoldering body back out, but she was okay. And Napoleon never forgot that. In addition, when Napoleon married Maria Louise, he was the stand-in proxy for the emperor at the official wedding. So they knew each other very well. Fortunately, in the Russian expedition, he didn't perform very well for Napoleon, and Napoleon was never really concerned about troops under his command towards his latter years. He was more concerned with Blucher and the Duke of Wellington. The King of Prussia, Frederick William III. He is born in 1770. He lives till 1840. He was king from 1797 to 1840. Now, Prussia is an absolute monarchy. The king has tremendous powers here, and there's no real checks on it, though. He has his ministers, but it's not like the Bismarck system that's set up later. The thing about William III is he is not really interested in getting involved in wars. Prussia stayed out of the wars with Napoleon for quite some time. His wife was completely different. Princess Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the Queen of Prussia. She hates the French, and she's aggravating her husband and working behind the scenes to make sure that war does eventually break out. The problem is that when she finally convinces her husband that he needs to get involved and join the Russians in the coalition, they are just crushed because the Prussian army has not been modernized for a very long time. And they were one of the most highly rated militaries in Europe prior to Napoleon, but they had kind of gone by the wayside. There's a section of the painting of the signing of the Treaty of Tilsit showing Napoleon being glared at by Queen Louisa. I have a couple of German history books that are on the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, and they always depict Queen Louisa as towering over Napoleon. And then here's an unusual picture of Queen Louisa. She looks like Queen Victoria. Now, Queen Louisa does not live into the Victorian age. She dies in 1810, but when the history books are written later on, they pretty much put everybody in the look of Queen Victoria. So you have to kind of be careful if you're looking for pictures to make sure that they're from the actual era and not later on. Field Marshal Gebhard Liebknecht von Blucher, Prussia's brilliant field marshal, a tenacious man. He is a fighter through and through. He was born in 1742 and died in 1819. He's known as Alt Verwärts, Old Forward, and his soldiers referred to him as Papa Blucher. He was loved by his troops, but he sometimes was a little bit overly aggressive. At the Battle of Ligny, he was so frustrated by the French tearing him apart that as the troops began to withdraw, he got on his horse and charged with his staff, and immediately were attacked by heavy French cavalry, which cut them all down, including Blucher, killed his horse and fell on him. And he lay on the battlefield with his horse on him as the two sides went back and forth, and they eventually did indeed rescue him. And he was not very coherent at the time, so his second in command took over and moved the troops to another location. The next day he was better mentally and was able to lead the troops over to help Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo. But he wanted to see Napoleon hanged from a tree. And the last thing Napoleon wanted to do was get captured by the Prussians. Russian Tsar Alexander I. Now, Alexander I, who was born in 1777 and lived till 1825, and was Tsar from 1801 to 1825, was also another absolute monarch. He probably had even more power than Frederick William III did. He certainly was a little bit better commander with his troops, but he is also an interesting individual from the standpoint that he's considered the first internationalist. After the Napoleonic Wars, he thought that everything that happened in Europe mattered to the rest of the world. In addition, he was very mercurial. He liked Napoleon, thought he was great, and then thought he was a monster, and then liked him and then went with the monster. He would change his mind. But one of the things about Alexander, he refused to allow the Allies, the coalition, to take out their revenge on France. He protected the country from being abused. He protected a lot of the Napoleonic family members from having their property taken and looted. Used his own troops to protect Prince Eugene's houses and some of the other people. He was also very aware of the settlement of the treaty, so he is quite an interesting individual. His wife is Louise, Princess of Baden. That was her name before she got married. She was probably Lutheran and became Orthodox, so her name as the Tsarina is Elizabeth Alexeyeva. She was married in 1793. She herself was born in 1779 and lived to 1826, lived to be the age of 47. Between the two of them, they had 2 children, but that's a sad tale because both daughters died at the age of 2. And the lack of children was kind of a separation between the two early on because he took mistresses quite frequently. His most famous mistress is Mary Naryashkin from 1799 to 1809, and that produced a child, Sophia Naryashkin, which he loved very much. But towards the end of his life, the Empress and Alexander became quite close. I believe asked for forgiveness and gave money to a lot of her charities. Russian Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov, who was born in 1745 and died in 1813. This is he's made field marshal at the age of 70, but he was one of the best commanders that the Russian army had. Problem that Kutuzov had was he was just getting old and he did not have a good general staff underneath him. There's quite a battle going on within the Russian army. You have Russian officers and then you have Prussian officers that have been fired or unsuccessful in the Prussian army that have been hired to fill in. And there's a little bit of a battle between the two sides. For example, the Battle of Borodino, most of his commanders who were of Prussian background believed that he should have retreated after the second day. He refused. He believed that he could still win and that they would fight another day, and then ultimately was forced to withdraw, but without losing his whole army. As a matter of fact, at the Battle of Borodino, unfortunately, he was so fat that he could not ride a horse any longer, so he moved from one part of the battlefield to the other in a 3-wheeled Russian cart called a dorky. But his men loved him, and he was tenacious. It would be interesting to have a battle of tenaciousness between Kutuzov and Marshal Blucher from the Prussian side. So that completes our kings and queens and commanders of the Napoleonic Wars. Just a brief overview. There's a biography on every one of these individuals that I've talked about, and in doing this, I found it hard to pick just 1 or 2 little instances. I could have gone on for long periods of time. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got some background as to what the other side of the political structure was that was fighting Napoleon, and thank you very much.